Welcome back. And oh, hold on a second. Call here. Hello? Wait, they do have to take a standardized test in government this year? Next Tuesday, April 27th? But and I have to finish up with economics. So I got to finish all the standards before next week. Yeah, that's right. So it sounds like the state government still wants you all to take the government end of course assessment, which you'll be doing next week in your labs, which means I need to finish up teaching you everything that's possibly going to be on the test, like in this video. Thankfully, though, we are already on the home stretch by teaching economics, but there were still plenty of other things I wanted to talk about, but I guess I got to kind of compress it all into this video. So get ready for a crash course in economics. Okay, not that type of crash course, a Mr. Lucas crash course. Okay, so over the past few weeks, we have been discussing economic topics, whether it be the minimum wage or occupational licensing and things like that. You'll notice with each of those topics, really the central question is, should government intervene in an economic issue regarding money or jobs or people's welfare? And people have different perspectives on how much government should intervene in the economy, if any at all. Generally speaking, while there's lots of different economic systems, you can broadly categorize them into three different categories. First of all, you may remember from history class learning about Adam Smith, but he argued in favor of a free market economy, kind of a laissez-faire economy, which is a term I know you've heard before, but that's French for hands-off. It's an economic policy in which governments intrude as little as possible in the economic transactions between citizens and businesses. And another word for that today is free enterprise, and that's a part of American culture we've kind of hit on before. Then on the complete other end of the spectrum is the command and control economy, which is a feature of a lot of leftist governments. And that's an economic policy in which government dictates much of the nation's economic activity, including the amount of production and price for goods. And then you have in the middle, which would be a mixed economy. And that's an economic policy in which many economic conditions are left to individuals and businesses, with the government regulating some economic activity. And this is what we have in the United States. There are private businesses, and then there are things like the post office and public education, which feature a lot of government intervention. There's also some pretty important economic terms that get thrown out there all the time that you ought to be familiar with. First of all, there's gross domestic product, or GDP, and that's the total value of goods and services produced by an economy. If there's ever 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, then we're considered to be in an economic recession or an economic downturn. Then there's the unemployment rate, which you hear politicians talk about all the time, and that's the percentage of people actively looking for work who cannot find jobs. You also hear politicians talk about something called inflation, and that's the rise in prices of goods and services. And you can often measure inflation and other factors by taking a look at the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, and that's the cost of a fixed basket of goods and services over time, and that's used to measure the cost of living. My personal favorite indicator of inflation is the Big Mac Index, which measures the real value of a Big Mac and the price of a Big Mac across multiple countries. It gives you a good indicator of what other countries' currencies are valued at, and it gives you a good idea of the rate of inflation in those other countries. Inflation is happening everywhere all the time. And again, the simple definition of it is basically just prices going up. If you were to take a look at the cost of living in 1924 and compare it to later years and even today, you'll see a significant difference. A new house in 1924 cost $7,720. In 1958, it cost $11,975. In 1983, it cost $82,000. Now it's around $250,000, give or take a little bit, because the housing market's a little bit insane right now. But of course, there were different average incomes back then. In 1924, the average income was $2,196 per year. In 1958, it was $4,650 per year. And in 1983, it was about $21,000 per year, while today it's around $50,000 per year. Now, I know oftentimes we look at those prices from back in the day and go, wow, look how much cheaper things were. And to a certain extent, they were, but as we learned in our lesson on the minimum wage last week, wages were lower, and the value of currency back then was worth more. A dime back in the day could buy you a lot more than a dime could today, and that's because of inflation. The value of the currency that you have has decreased over time, which means you can't buy as much with it. How much you can buy with this single dollar is often referred to as your purchasing power. If the value of your money is worth more, then that means your purchasing power is more. That means one of these can buy more products, or at least more valuable products. But if the value of this decreases, that means your purchasing power also decreases. It means you can't buy as much with one of these. So the crazy thing about inflation is that it's going on right now. Like as we speak, the money in your wallet is changing in its value constantly. Unfortunately, it's not a change for the better. Here, let's actually check it out like right now. Yeah, like seriously, let's run a little test. If you have any cash on you, go ahead and get some out. If you don't have any cash on you, steal your friend's cash. Get out any piece of paper currency you can find, whether it be a $1 bill, $5 bill, $10 bill, $20 bill, $50 bill, etc. Then find the year that it was made. Usually that's on the front side of the bill. Go ahead, pause the video and try to find it. I'm about to show you a website where you can find out just how much the money you have in your pocket is decreased since it was made. So for example, I've got this 20 here, and this 20 was made in 2013. Wow, way back when Gangnam Style was still popular. So if you go to the link that I'll provide to you here in a second, Edpuzzle, and you go to the year of 1913, which is where it starts off at, and I were to put in 2013, that's the year that this 20 was made, and since it's a $20 bill, I'll put in 20 here, and then click calculate. It says that if in 2013 I purchased an item with this 20 for 20 bucks, then in 2021 that same item would cost $22.46, a cumulative rate of inflation of 12.3%. So here's the link. I encourage you to check it out. Wait, Mr. Lucas, hang on. So like when I get paid, let's say I get paid like $100 this week and I put it in savings. So like 10 years from now, that $100 isn't really going to be worth $100 anymore? Correct. It'll be worth less than $100, which means it won't be able to buy you as much as it can today. Wait, so like I lose, like, what was that term you used? Purchasing power? And that's ridiculous. It's like I'm getting robbed. It's because you are. So that leads us to ask the question, what's causing the money in your wallet to lose its value so quickly? And what's causing prices to go up? Turns out there's a lot of reasons, and we won't be able to go over all of them in a whole lot of depth in this video. But it's important to note that not everything is necessarily getting more expensive. So within the last 20 years, multiple things have changed in price. They've inflated in price, while some things have deflated in price. Things like hospital services, college tuition and fees, college textbooks have inflated in price and become more expensive in the last 20 years, while things like TVs, toys, computer software, wireless telephone services, those have all decreased in price. So we would say that they've become more affordable. So what's the difference here between these items? Well, a large part of this can be explained by the law of supply and demand. You see, the law of supply and demand can often help us determine the price of a good or service. If there's a lot of something out there, it's easier for people to get their hands on. Therefore, they don't need to pay as much. Even if there's not much of something out there, if people don't really care about it, then the price is going to be pretty low because there's not much demand for it. People don't really want to spend money on it for some reason. So if you're going to sell something where there's not much demand for it, you're going to have to lower your price in order to get someone to bite on it. It's like this Paxton Lynch jersey I bought when the Denver Broncos drafted him. Turned out he was a total bust, and no one really wanted to buy the jersey because he only lasted in the league for a few years and barely did anything. So I ended up having to give it to Goodwill. So in the grand scheme of Denver Broncos jerseys, there weren't a lot of his jerseys made because he only lasted 2 or 3 years, but obviously it wasn't worth much. Why? Because the demand wasn't there for it. But on the flip side, if there's not as much of something out there, but people really want it and the demand for it is high, then the price is going to be higher. Speaking of sports, an autographed Tom Brady rookie card recently sold for $2.5 million. There were only so many made and only so many that were autographed by Tom Brady himself, but obviously there was a very big demand for the few cards that were out there in circulation, so people were willing to pay a pretty penny to have that card. Which baffles me because it's a piece of cardboard. And it also goes to show you that prices can also be determined by people's subjective values they place on them. For example, at an art auction, someone took a banana and duct taped it to a wall and got it to sell for $120,000. Again, value is subjective. It's true what they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and we all place different values on different things because we're all different. So you often see economists use supply and demand charts where you'll see some sort of a graph like this. And this is how economists and folks in the business world try to determine prices for different things. They try to determine the supply of a product or service, and then they also try to determine what the demand is for that. And then that is usually going to determine around what the price is going to be. And that is called equilibrium. All right, so back to why some things are getting more expensive, but some things are actually getting more affordable. It has to do with, and yes, you guessed it, supply and demand. If you notice things at the bottom of this chart, such as television, toys, computer software, and even cell phones, all of those things are being mass produced. And to tie this in with last week's minimum wage lesson, a lot of the companies that make those products overseas where labor costs are cheaper. Therefore, they can afford to produce more products. And when you have a greater supply, you guessed it, you can drop the price even if the demand is pretty high for it. So again, despite the high demand for things like cell phones and other pieces of technology, they've been becoming more affordable because they're being mass produced. The supply is greater, and they're also becoming easier and cheaper to make. On the flip side, though, you see things like hospital services and college tuition and fees and other things in the medical and educational fields skyrocketing in price. Why? Well, it's kind of hard to mass produce hospitals and colleges like you can technology with TVs and cell phones. So because there's a fixed supply of infrastructure for those things and there's high demand for it, that means the prices are going to be high. And unfortunately, that's further complicated by government subsidies. A government subsidy is a financial benefit given to an individual. So the government subsidies we're talking about in this context would be if the government gives you a loan to help pay for your education, or things like Medicare and Medicaid, where the government helps pay for medical costs for those who need it. Sometimes subsidies can also be government taking taxpayer money and giving it directly to an institution like a public university to help them pay for their expenses so that they can lower their costs. But see, therein lies part of the problem, because government is driving demand for those goods and services. But as I said, the supply is more fixated. When government says, yeah, I'll help you pay for your college, or I'll help you pay for your medical expenses, that allows you to enter the marketplace for those things. And the more people enter the marketplace for those goods and services, the more demand there is, obviously. But from the perspective of the folks who are setting prices at the universities or setting prices in the medical fields, the government giving subsidies to individuals is like a sugar daddy with bottomless pockets. Let's think about it this way. If you run a restaurant and I came to you and said, hey, I gave my buddy over $100 to spend at your restaurant tonight, it would kind of be smart of you to actually charge him maybe a little bit more, because he's got plenty of money now to spend at your restaurant tonight. You know he can afford the increase in price because I basically promised to give him $100 and have him spend it at your place. And so that similarly happens in the healthcare and the educational fields when universities and those setting prices in the medical industries see that government is giving subsidies and promising people to help them pay for their medical expenses and their college tuition. So part of it is an increase in demand, but part of it's also greed on behalf of those setting prices in those industries, knowing that government's going to foot the bill and help people pay for things. And because government's giving them money to help pay for those things, they think that they can increase their prices and government will help make up the difference. Now, whenever the economy falls or has a recession, like we talked about earlier, Democrats typically like to increase government subsidies. They want to increase demand by injecting more money into the economy, and this is known as Keynesian economics. It's basically the idea that if the economy is slumping, the way to jumpstart it is to get the government to inject money into people's pockets, whether that be through creating new jobs to build roads and bridges or schools, or giving people money directly through checks. And actually the stimulus checks that your parents, or maybe even some of you have been getting, are examples of Keynesian economic thought. The idea with stimulus checks is that when you get the stimulus check, you'll go spend that money on something that you want, and that increase in demand will help the economy. Keynesian economics became popular when FDR implemented a lot of Keynesian economic policies with his New Deal during the Great Depression. However, when Ronald Reagan became president in the 1980s, after about a decade of high inflation, he thought the best way to bring inflation down was with a new economic theory called supply-side economics. The idea was it's not demand you need to fix to jumpstart the economy, it's actually supply you need to fix to jumpstart the economy. So Republicans in the 1980s did things like cut taxes, hoping that if a business gets a tax cut, they would then reallocate that money as they saw fit for their business. Maybe they increase production and the supply of goods. Maybe they lower prices. Maybe they invest in their workers and increase their salaries. So the idea was that tax cuts would help people go out and spend more money and would help companies lower their prices or reallocate money to where it needed to be, as opposed to government directly just giving people money. Republicans felt instead of government determining where money would go, that private people and private businesses would better be able to judge where money should go as opposed to central planners and politicians. Okay, Mr. Lucas, so it sounds like Democrats trust government to inject money into the economy where they see fit, whereas Republicans more trust the people and private businesses to put money where it should go. But both of them believe in kind of giving money back to the people in a sense. So whenever the economy begins to slump, that would explain why Democrats want to spend more and Republicans want to typically cut taxes. Yep, that's right. Okay, but like, what does this have to do with inflation, though? All right, so whenever the government spends more money or it cuts taxes, which is its source of revenue by which it gets money in order to pay for things, it runs what's called a deficit. And a deficit is whenever you spend more money than you take in. So imagine earning $100 a week, but spending $150 in expenses. You'd have a $50 deficit. But over time, deficits can add up to where they become debt. And debt is the amount of money that you owe to people. Well, here's the issue. People like for the government to spend money on them. They like for government subsidies to give them benefits, but they don't want to have to pay for it through an increase in taxes. So because people want things and they also don't want to pay for them, our government goes in debt to pay for them. Yeah, $28 trillion worth of debt. Well, at least that's what it was a week ago when I recorded this. I don't know what it is now. You may want to check it. In fact, here's a link where you can check it anytime, real time. I could do a whole video on the national debt and the government's budgeting process, but unfortunately, it's one of the things I'm not going to have time for this year. But when the government spends that much money and injects that much money into the economy, it causes inflation, and it goes back to the law of supply and demand. The more dollars there are in circulation, the less valuable $1 is. Okay, so supply and demand can impact prices, and sometimes government subsidy can drive demand and cause inflation, which can also cause the value of your money to decrease over time. But there's also another way your money can decrease over time. It involves something called monetary policy. Now, have you ever stopped and wondered who actually makes money? Like seriously, who made this and who owns it technically? Well, if you look on any paper currency, you'll see where it says Federal Reserve Note. What does that mean? Well, it's all about monetary policy. When the government uses tax rates and government spending to impact the economy, that's called fiscal policy. Monetary policy is a set of economic policy tools designed to regulate the amount of money in the economy. And that's pretty important because too much money supply in the economy can lead to inflation. It can lead to the dollar becoming worthless because there's a heck of a lot of it out there. And this is all done by the central bank or the Federal Reserve of the United States. And that's a board of governors, Federal Reserve banks, and member banks responsible for monetary policy. It's sometimes referred to as the Fed. And the board members are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and serve for fixed terms. The board members are appointed to oversee one of 12 districts that you see on this map. Each district has a Federal Reserve Bank that monitors monetary policy in the area. So fun fact, if you look at a piece of paper currency and you notice the serial code, it will start with a letter. And on dollar bills, it's actually circled, that letter. That letter indicates which Federal Reserve Bank this banknote originated from. This dollar has an A on the serial code, which means it came from Boston. If you're curious where the money you have came from, take a look at this chart, which shows you the letter in the corresponding Federal Reserve Bank that money originated from. It's kind of cool to see the story of your money, to know that it originated maybe all the way across the country and somehow made its way right into your pocket. So the fact that money says Federal Reserve Note on it and it has a serial code corresponding to a certain Federal Reserve Bank kind of gives us a hint at who technically owns and issues money. It's the United States government through the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Department of Treasury. The U.S. Department of the Treasury, which is part of the executive branch, part of the president's cabinet, that department is the one that actually prints the money. They design the money and they actually print it, but then the Federal Reserve is the one that will order the money from the Treasury and then issue it out to people. They'll issue it out to banks and credit unions, and then the banks and credit unions will then issue it out to you whenever you take out a loan or you go to the ATM. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913 by this guy, Mr. Woodrow Wilson. The Federal Reserve has three main tools to influence the economy. Number one, it can buy and sell treasuries. Number two, it sets the reserve rates that require banks to have a certain amount of deposits kept in reserves. And number three, it influences interest rates banks pay to borrow money from the federal government. So as the economy grows, the Fed will use tools to try to control inflation. The goal of the Federal Reserve was to try to be one step ahead of the economy, to be almost a guiding force in the business cycle to prevent these really big booms from occurring, followed by these really big crashes from occurring. So what you see here on the left is what the Fed is trying to achieve. It's trying to prevent what you see on the right from happening, these really big booms and busts. So if the Federal Reserve sees the economy growing rapidly and maybe booming too much, they'll try to contract the economy. It's called contractionary monetary policy. And if they see that the economy is down and they need to kickstart it back up, they'll try to expand the economy through expansionary monetary policy. As we dive into the specifics of what those policies do, it's important to know two terms: what a government security is and what a discount rate is. The Fed will try to control the economy by changing the interest rates, which are sometimes called discount rates, at which it lends money out to banks. So an interest rate is sometimes called a discount rate, is an additional fee to borrow money. For example, an interest rate of 3% on a loan that the bank may give you of $250,000 equals an additional $7,500 that will be paid back to the bank that lent the money. This is how the bank makes a profit. And the Federal Reserve kind of does the same thing. The difference is they're the ones lending the money out to the banks. I mean, the money is kind of theirs. So they're the ones that lend it to the banks who lend it to you. So if the economy's down in the dumps and the Federal Reserve wants to jumpstart the economy and get it back going, they're going to want to expand the economy. So they'll engage in expansionary monetary policy. And this is when the Federal Reserve increases the supply of money in the economy. So think of it this way. People need money when the economy's down, so the Federal Reserve increases the monetary supply. It means there's more dollar bills floating around in the United States. To do this, they can lower the discount rates. So that makes it less expensive to take out a loan, which encourages people to go take out loans and to go buy things. If the bank doesn't have to spend as much money borrowing money from the Fed, they'll often pass that discount on to you. So if you see that there's low interest rate on loans, then you may be more encouraged to go buy a car or a house, because in the long run, you're going to save money. You're not going to have to pay the bank back quite as much money. So that encourages people to go out and buy things. The other way the Federal Reserve can expand the monetary supply is by decreasing the reserve requirement. This lets banks keep less money locked up so they can give more out. That's essentially what a reserve requirement is. It tells the banks they have to lock up a certain amount of money and keep it in there. And then lastly, they can buy up government securities. This pays people back for buying a government bond. You can literally tell the government, hey, I'm going to give you money in exchange for you giving me a little bit more money back in the future. And that injects money into the economy for people to spend. My own grandma ended up buying a government bond when I was born. And then when I turned 18, she got that money back and gave it to me for college. And she actually got more money back than what she paid in. So all of these three things encourages people to take out loans and to buy things because it's cheaper to borrow money. Since demands go up, prices will often go up too, and this causes inflation when the Fed expands the monetary supply. Now, if the Fed sees that the economic growth in the country is getting out of control to the point where they're like, oh my gosh, this is going to come crashing down before too long, then the Fed will basically do the opposite of everything I just told you, and it's called contractionary monetary policy. And that's when the Fed tries to decrease the supply of money in the economy. So to do that, they'll increase the discount rate, make it more expensive to take out loans, which will discourage people from going out and buying things and kind of pump the brakes on that. It will increase the reserve requirement and force banks to hold more money locked up and not give out quite as much. And then they will end up selling government securities, which will have the opposite effect of buying the government securities. So this discourages more people to take out loans and buy things, and it makes it more expensive to borrow money. So since demand goes down, prices will often go down as well, and this causes deflation. Now, why does it all matter? Well, if you hear them talk in the news that the Federal Reserve might expand the monetary supply and engage in expansionary monetary policy, well, that's going to increase the economy's growth. It's going to increase prices due to more demand for products, and more money in circulation means the currency is not worth as much. So expansionary monetary policy can decrease unemployment, but it increases prices. If you hear them talking in the news about the Fed engaging in contractionary monetary policy, you know it's going to slow the economy's growth. It's going to decrease prices due to less demand for products and less money being in circulation. So the currency is going to be worth more. You're going to get more bang for your buck. So contractionary monetary policy can increase unemployment because it slows the economy down, but it does decrease prices because it increases the value of the dollar. So each year I usually illustrate this in class by getting like a full-size Kit Kat bar or something, and then I distribute a few of these out. They're Mr. Lucas government currency, and they're about as worthless as the real American dollar. Usually I just drop off a handful of these things to like 5 or 6 students in the class, and then I have an all-out bidding war for the Kit Kat bar. I mean, it might sell for something like, I don't know, 6 of these. But of course, the sad thing is there's a ton of students that don't have any of these. So I end up printing more off, and I start dropping off more handfuls to more students around the class. And then I have another bidding war for the Kit Kat bar. And this time, the price rises astronomically because there's more people with more money, which means that the value of this isn't worth quite as much because there's more of it out there. And this demand for this Kit Kat bar has created a bidding war, which has jacked the price up. So hopefully that illustrates to you how prices can increase when the Fed expands the monetary supply. Understanding what causes inflation and how it works can be a very powerful tool. I mean, just look at this kid I found on TikTok.
I've been dealing with a lot of ants in my room recently, and I've put out traps, I've used raid, none of it's worked, so I've decided that if they're gonna fight dirty, then so am I. So the new plan is I'm going to give each ant an entire loaf of bread. And you might, if you have a little tiny pea brain, you might be thinking, man, this isn't gonna work. Let's listen to the whole plan. The bread tactic is going to destabilize the entire ant economy. They're going to have no idea what to do because the value of the crumb is going to plummet to 0. They're going to be fighting within their new ranks to find a new currency. The queen will be probably assassinated, and suddenly I'm God. I'm the ant king.
And that's how you use inflation as an economic weapon. Sounds like a good plan to me. Knowledge is power, kids. And there's the Federal Reserve for you. Well, at least a basic explanation of the Federal Reserve. And of course, like with most things, not everyone is necessarily a fan of the Federal Reserve. Many have argued that it distorts the market and that it has made things worse. I mean, since its inception in 1913, you can see that inflation has really skyrocketed since the Federal Reserve was created. And if the purpose of the Fed was to steady the business cycle and to stop these big booms and busts from happening, it definitely failed to prevent the biggest bust in economic history, the Great Depression. And then it failed to stop the hyperinflation of the 1970s, and then it failed to stop the Great Recession. I mean, those are some pretty major L's. But of course, I leave all judgments of the Fed up to you. All right, so this week you've got this ed puzzle, one other ed puzzle, and then you have a Google form over economics that kind of reviews some of the main concepts we've talked about. And then I'm also going to post some review material for you to study for the government end of course exam, which, as I said at the beginning of the video, you're going to have to take Tuesday, April 27th in lab. I'm not exactly sure what all they're going to put on it this year, but in the past, it's been very amendment heavy. So make sure you study your constitutional amendments, but don't just necessarily memorize the amendments themselves. Also know historically what was going on at that time that led people to want to create the amendment. I've covered literally everything in the standards except maybe a little bit about the Ohio Constitution. But really the big thing you need to know is that our state government in Ohio has had 2 constitutions it's operated under, and the more recent one, created in 1851, improved off of the first one. And one of the big changes it made was that it actually created more judges because judges under the first constitution had too heavy of a workload. Like relevant content. Well, that'll do it for this week. Still check back on Monday. I'll post your assignments for next week, but next week will look a little bit different since you have to take the test. I'll factor that into your workload. As always, reach out if you need anything. Have a great week.